Fernando Valley unit of the League of Women Voters of Greater Los Angeles. We're very glad to have all of you here with us today. I'm Joyce Batten, and I'm acting today as the chair of our unit. I suspect that some of you in our audience may be new to the League, so here are a few words right now about who we are and what we do. We are a nonpartisan political organization. We encourage informed and active participation in government. We work to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and we try to influence public policy through education and advocacy. So that's who we are. We have a couple of announcements before we start our program today. In case you were expecting to attend our outdoor fundraising event this Saturday, it has been postponed due to the threat of heavy rain. You'll be receiving an email fairly soon announcing the postponement with the new date as soon as it has been scheduled. Next, our new unit sponsors a book club, and Sue Strickland will mention the next date and book that we're going to be reading. Sue?
Thank you, Joyce. Our next book is Those Angry Days by Lynn Olson. It's one of several books that we have read by her. She's a very easy read. This book is about the period of time between 1939 and 1941 and the isolationists in the United States versus what she refers to as the interventionists. That meeting will be on Zoom on March 15th at 12:30. I've put my contact information in the chat, and my dear friend Anne will set up the Zoom, and I will be happy to send the link to any and all who are interested. Sometimes we get as few as 5 people, other times as many as 25. So, and we welcome new readers, and I hope you will join us.
Thank you,
Joyce.
Sue. Thank you. And now on to our program. Jean Thompson, our program chair, will introduce our speaker. Jean?
Okay. Joining many of the League members in the whole country, we are involved in studying the immigration situation in the United States. To participate in this major effort, we are holding our first 2 meetings. First one is going to be today. The co-director of the Center of Comparative Immigrant Studies at the University of California, San Diego, is Professor David Scott FitzGerald. He's the author of many award-winning books and papers. Will give us a brief history of national U.S. immigration law and a more thorough discussion of its current impacts on the current topics in California. And I'll just let you know that the second meeting will be on Thursday, March 16th, when the Executive Director of Immigrant Defenders Law Center, Lindsay Tuchowski, I'm not sure I can pronounce her last name, will present the unique and comprehensive legal representation assisting immigrant children, attempting to reunite separated families, support for deported veterans, and helping detained illegal immigrants. That should keep you busy to learn all that. And thank you so much, David, for coming today. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the introduction here. I'll go ahead and start this presentation here. Can everyone see my slides?
Yeah, I see him.
Fantastic, fantastic. So, I've always been a consumer of the information produced by your organization. So it's a particular honor to be able to talk about these issues with you today. I'm going to focus on the situation in California and try to go behind some of the headlines, but I'm also happy to talk about national level policies when we get into the Q&A, and I'll make a few other references to national policy as we go. But California is in many ways one of the world's leading destinations of immigrants. In fact, if California were its own country, it would be the world's 5th largest country of immigration after the US, Germany, Saudi Arabia, and Russia. So it's a very important immigrant destination, and it always has been since the founding of the state. But it's really that notion that it can be considered almost its own nation of immigrants that prompted a group of scholars throughout the University of California system to produce this volume that came out in 2021 on Immigrant California, Understanding the Past, Present, and Future of U.S. Policy. And I won't go through all of the different chapters, but the bottom line is that experts in different areas of policymaking, from education to economic policy, have written chapters about the implications of immigration in those specific areas of California policymaking. So first, what I'm going to do, though, is just give you a really brief background of the demographic profile of immigrants in the state before segueing into the more direct policy and legal history. So about 27% of the population of California is foreign-born. That's the highest of any state in the U.S. By contrast, in the U.S. as a whole, it's about 14%. And California has always had a much larger percentage of its population foreign-born than the U.S. as a whole. So in the graph, you can see the darker bar is the percentage of the population that was foreign-born in California, and the lighter bar in the U.S. as a whole. And you can see that from the beginning of the state, that there has always been a very large component. The highest was actually in the first year for which we have information, 1870, where fully 38% of the state's population was foreign-born. So it's high now, but it's actually been higher in the early part of the state's history. Now, one of the big changes, though, in California's immigrant population has been in the origin continents and specific countries of its immigrants. And so in this graph, we can see the share of the immigrant population in California in 1900 compared to 2017. The big story here is of a significant, maybe 20% of the population coming from Asia at the beginning of that period, but now much, much larger and growing since the mid 20th century, when there was a major policy reform in 1965 that took away the explicitly racist immigration basis of U.S. law and made it more open to people from various parts of the world. We see that historically the immigration stream was much more dominated by immigration from Europe. There are still lots of Europeans coming to California, but a much smaller share than they were up until the end of that law in 1965. There has always been a Latin American migration to California. Of course, California was part of Mexico before it was taken by the US in 1848. And that is a story of a more steady increase from the early part of the century up until the 1990s, and then it's actually crested and is declining as a share of the foreign-born population of the U.S., something that's not really fully realized, I think, in the public sphere. In fact, if you look at new immigration to California, zooming into the last few years here, we can see that the new immigration to California is much more dominated by people coming from Asia than people coming from Latin America. So there's been a major decline from Latin America that I don't think is really, again, registered in the policy sphere yet. One of the striking things about immigration to California is that people come from all over the world. And yes, Mexico was the number one source with 38% of immigrants. But after that, you can see, almost any country that you can think of, with the major other nationalities being the Philippines, China, Vietnam, India, and several nationalities in Central America and so forth. The immigrant population of the state is to be found throughout the state, but it's much more urban than the population as a whole. So no surprise for those of us who live in Southern California, for example, where the immigrant population is very highly concentrated in the urban areas of Northern California and Southern California. No surprise to those of us who are here. When it comes to the educational composition of the population, if we compare that to the educational composition of the native-born population, you can see that these are immigrants on the right. These are native-born people on the left. That immigrants in the state have representation throughout the hierarchy of higher education. 11% have an advanced degree, 18% have at least a bachelor's degree, and so forth. The difference between the two populations is that there is a larger percentage of the immigrant population that has very low levels of formal education. About a third have less than a high school education. If you look at the more recent immigrants coming to California, they're becoming much more educated than they have been in the past. When it comes to language use, which has always been a politically hot topic in this state, 70% of immigrants report speaking English proficiently. Only about 10% say they speak no English. These would overwhelmingly be recent arrivals with very low levels of formal education from non-English speaking countries. At home, most people, regardless of their background, speak a language other than English, at least with their parents. The most common languages being Spanish and Chinese, but again, you can find scores of languages spoken at home by California's immigrant communities. Legal status, always another hot topic in the state. 53% of all immigrants have actually naturalized as U.S. citizens, and I'm happy to chat in the Q&A about what the requirements are for naturalizing and why some immigrants are not eligible to naturalize or are eligible and yet don't naturalize. But more than half have naturalized as U.S. citizens. Another quarter have some kind of legal status. Typically, that's a green card, a lawful permanent residence, where under normal circumstances, the person is able to continue to renew that status and live here indefinitely, and have many of the same rights of citizens, but not the right to vote, not the right to run for office. There's some other distinctions that we could talk about. But so that's most of the population has some kind of legal status, whether it's a lawful permanent resident status or naturalization, but 22% are in an unauthorized status. And that's where most of the political focus is at. Something else that hasn't really registered, I think, in the public domain is that the number of unauthorized immigrants in the state is actually declining. Between 2010 and 2019, it fell by more than 500,000 people. And the vast majority, I don't have California's specific data on this, but the vast majority of the unauthorized population nationally has been in the US for a very long time. More than 80% of unauthorized immigrants in the US have lived in the US for more than a decade. So that means that this is a population that has, in general, quite deep roots in the US in terms of often having children in the US, maybe intermarrying with a US citizen, deeply embedded in the workforce and religious institutions and so forth. Another hot topic is always what are the economic effects of immigration to California, and we can break that down into different kinds of effects and distinguish between fiscal effects, that is, effects of having to do with government spending and also government revenue, from other broader economic effects. So looking, and here, these are not my figures, I'm just a consumer of figures produced by a national group in the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine that produced a report a few years ago on the entire US, but then they also looked at a handful of the major states of immigration. And there, in their estimate, the fiscal effect of the first generation of immigrants was a net cost of about $2,000. The second generation, that is the children of immigrants, produced an average net benefit of around $1,500. The third generation, that would be grandchildren of immigrants, produced an average net benefit of $3,000. This is largely driven by higher levels of education over time, English fluency, a number of other factors that we could discuss. So over the course of 3 generations, they calculate a net positive of about $1,000. If we think more broadly about economic effects of migration, not simply government revenues and expenditures, but more broad effects, the starting point that almost all economists would agree with is that the skills that immigrants bring typically complement those of the native-born population rather than substitute. So they typically go together because they are slightly different rather than having natives and immigrants competing for the same jobs. It's not that that never happens, but that's the broad pattern. So what are the effects of that economic reality? Well, over the long run, between 1990 and 2004, they estimate that immigration to the state caused a slight increase in the wages of the average US-born worker in California, even after accounting for inflation. But there are different effects for different kinds of native-born people. So for those who have the lowest levels of education, those who didn't finish high school, there was about a zero effect on the wages of those workers. For those who are very, very highly skilled natives who have at least some college, they were receiving the greatest gains of something on the order of 6 or 7% of their wages. Really the only group that saw a significant loss in their wages was other immigrants, and that's where there's much more competition for similar kinds of jobs as people who have recently arrived themselves. Okay, so let's take a quick look at the demographic pyramid of California's immigrants and compare that to the native-born population. So that's the native-born population on the left and the darker bars, and the foreign-born population on the right and the lighter bars. And the lower the lower bars are representing well, babies and toddlers, ages 0 to 5 is the first category, all the way up to the very top. It's those who are 91 years or older. And the bottom line here is that California's immigrants are really overrepresented in what economists would call the working age population. So really overrepresented in the group of people who are in their mid-20s up through, say, through 65 or so. Most immigrants have come to the state to work. So that means that the immigrant population of children, for example, is actually extremely small relative to the native-born population. Immigrants in the California labor force are overrepresented as that's just one derivation of what I was just showing you in that population pyramid. While overall immigrants are 27% of the population, they're 37% of California's labor force. And in particular sectors, they're extremely overrepresented. So immigrants are 69% of agricultural workers. They're 42% of the STEM labor force. That's science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. If we think about who was driving the high-tech sector of California's economy in places like Silicon Valley and in LA, Orange County, San Diego, our university system, including I'm at the University of California, immigrants are highly overrepresented in those most dynamic sectors of the state's tech economy. And nowhere more dramatically than if you look at Silicon Valley, where 74% of the tech labor force was born overseas. Overall, though, immigrants make less money than the native-born population. As of 2018, immigrants were making about $20 an hour on average, whereas the US-born were making $27 an hour. Okay, let's move to state policy and the history of that policy, which is often forgotten, but very much has shaped the kind of state that we are today. Now, this is a poster that you probably wouldn't see hanging in California these days. California, a cornucopia of the world, room for millions of immigrants. This was a publicity poster put up in eastern seaboard cities like New York, trying to attract immigrants from Europe out to California. When I arrived in California in 1994, the welcome had definitely grown sour. That was a period when, well, it was a period of Prop 187, which I'll talk about in a moment. The beginning, though, of state level policymaking around immigration in California goes back to its beginning as a state, and was especially focused on making conditions very difficult for the Chinese population of the state, as well as trying to keep out other Chinese migrants from arriving here. And the way that these policies were developed in the state interacted with federal policy. So, for example, this was a time when the US had a very explicitly racialized and racist naturalization policy, where beginning in 1790, only whites were allowed to become US citizens. After the Civil War, that was the franchise was extended to people of African descent. But I won't go through all of the restrictions. We can talk about that if you like in Q&A. But until 1952, there were restrictions on particular groups, such that, for example, Japanese people could not naturalize as US citizens until 1952. So if you see a law that says that someone who is ineligible for US citizenship, that is a way of targeting in effect here various Asian populations. So in 1850, there was a special tax applied on minors who were ineligible for US citizenship. The tax didn't say anything about Chinese or the other Asian groups, but in practice, that was the group that was being targeted through this formulation. There were a lot of other state level policies that restricted life for Chinese in the States, such as the one in 1854 that prevented them from testifying in court, a tax that created a particular, it was assessed only on arriving ship passengers who were ineligible for US citizenship. Again, this was directed at Chinese people. A law passed in 1858 to prevent the immigration of Chinese or so-called Mongolians. That term is not how anyone would have described themselves, but that was the term used in the law as a means of keeping out East Asian groups. Now, these days, when you go to San Francisco, you can walk around in Chinatown. It's one of the major tourist destinations in San Francisco. People come from around the world to enjoy its restaurants and to walk around and marvel at the architecture. What they may not know is that the reason that Chinatown exists in San Francisco, but also in Los Angeles and in San Diego, although the remains of it are almost completely gone, but in every other California city, is that if you were Chinese, you were required by law during much of the 19th century to live in segregated Chinatowns. So this was a policy that was enforced against the Chinese population. This was in the state constitution, actually, the constitution that was passed in 1879 that gave the cities the authority to create those kinds of Chinatowns. And this was done with the support of the vast majority of the state's population. There was a referendum on Chinese immigration and whether or not it should be allowed in 1879. And 154,000 people voted that Chinese immigration should be banned, and only 883 supported its continuation. The state assembly later banned all Chinese immigration. So, and at a national level, I should say that in 1882, the US federal government, responding in large part to policymakers in Western states like California, passed a law that prohibited the immigration of Chinese labor. Okay, so let's talk about anti-miscegenation laws in California. Anti-miscegenation laws that prevent intermarriage across racial boundaries, you might think is something that would be restricted to the states of the Confederacy, for example, but that would be inaccurate. So right here in the Golden State, there is a laundry list of laws that were passed to prevent these kinds of intermarriages, beginning with one in 1850 to reinforce the black-white color line, but then adding the so-called, again, in quotation marks, Mongolians in 1880, Japanese in 1909, Asians broadly in 1931, Malays in 1933, targeting Filipino immigrants, And these were on the books in California until 1948, when they were overturned in the state. Later overturned, other states' policies were overturned in the 1960s and Loving v. Virginia at the national level. Okay, educational segregation. Again, you might think that that's something that you would find only in the states of the former Confederacy, but not so. There was a law passed in the 1930s, for example, that segregated schools for kids of so-called Chinese, Japanese, or Mongolian parentage. That's the school as it existed in San Francisco. There were a couple of very important court cases around this issue of segregation. One near where I live in San Diego, in the community of Lemon Grove in 1931, where the school had segregated children of Mexican origin. The parents of the children sued, and they took their case to a local court, so a state level court. And it was the first school desegregation court decision in the US. That it was actually won by the plaintiffs, but because it was filed in what was then known as the San Diego Superior Court, it didn't set a legal precedent at the national level. So it's not a cited case, but it's important in terms of the mobilization against this kind of legal segregation of schools. What was a precedent-setting case, although it's not probably as widely famous as it should be, is the Mendez v. Westminster case. So we're speaking here about Westminster in Orange County, where in 1946, a federal circuit court ruled that segregation there was unlawful because it was segregating school children of so-called Mexican blood. And legally, Mexicans in the 1940s were considered to be white. So this kind of segregation continued in California until Governor Earl Warren desegregated the schools. And this is, before Brown v. Board of Education in the 1950s at a federal level. Okay, another one of the extremely important laws in California that were designed to restrict economic opportunities of immigrants and Asians in particular was the so-called Alien Land Law, which passed the state legislature and was signed into effect, passed in 1913. And this law prevented, quote, aliens ineligible for citizenship from owning agricultural land. So it was very much targeting South Asians from Punjab, modern Pakistan and India, and also Japanese and Chinese who had established farms throughout the state. So that was on the books until 1952 as well. And then we come to residential segregation. So in 2010, a couple in San Diego bought this house in the Normal Heights neighborhood. And when they bought the house, the previous owners had done some work to see if it could fall under the Mills Act, which tries to maintain historic homes and prevents changes to the homes in exchange for lowering property taxes. So as part of that process, the previous owners had gone through all kinds of documents down at City Hall around the house, and they had found that in 1945 that an earlier owner, an even earlier owner of this house, as well as other property owners in the area, had reaffirmed a racial covenant in the housing title. So in the title of the house, it said that the house would never be conveyed or sold, rented to someone who was not white. And that is my house. That is the house that I live in. That is not a house in Mississippi or Alabama and Louisiana. That is a house in Normal Heights. That story of racial covenants is common throughout Southern California, including Los Angeles, where at one point about 80% of the housing stock was under a racial covenant. And this was something that was done at the behest of the federal government, as well as with local support. I won't go into all of the details of this, but suffice it to say that part of the program of FDR during the Great Depression, part of the New Deal, was to try to create various mechanisms to to get mortgages to homeowners and to protect existing homeowners from foreclosure. And that's where they made the notorious redlining maps and other kinds of maps that would create different zones in the city and make it easier or harder for people to get a home loan, depending on where the geographic boundaries of the city were in relation to their residence or where they intended to buy. And the areas that were considered to be undesirable had, quote, expiring restrictions. This is a reference to these racial covenants or lack of them, or infiltration of a, quote, lower grade population. Green hotspots, for example, are considered to be desirable, in part because they're, quote unquote, homogenous. This is kind of a dog whistle for racial homogeneity, I would argue. And all of these distinctions mattered when it came to whether or not people could receive mortgage funding. So the Federal Housing Administration also insisted that racial covenants be used as a condition for receiving funding from the FHA. They created model racial covenants, and this went into the formal rules of the FHA. So this was not something that was done even secretly, is that they were trying to maintain the static nature of the social and racial classes at a time when many new immigrants were arriving, and also migrants moving from other parts of the U.S., including from the U.S. South, African Americans moving from the U.S. South to California. Okay, so I'll go through this here. But another point is that professional realtors had an ethical obligation, according to the ethics as they were elaborated in those organizations' manuals, not to sell across interracial lines. So not to sell if doing so would violate that racial line. And they understood that to mean African Americans as well as Mexicans and Asians. In San Diego, and I think the picture is probably quite similar in LA, these racial covenants were around beginning in 1882. They were upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court in the 1920s. It wasn't until 1948 that they were struck down in court, but they existed even on paper in the titles that are available for public perusal in San Diego as late as 1957. And they were enforced even after they were not on paper, well into the 1960s in San Diego. Now, one of the ways that segregation continued to be enforced even into the 1960s was in La Jolla, where I work, where UC San Diego is, where the real estate brokers got together and decided that they would develop a united front to prevent Jewish people from coming into the area and buying homes. And the bottom line is that if a Jewish person came in and was seeking to buy a home, they would be told, oh, well, we don't have any properties available for you. And then they had a backup system. They called it the green card system, which has nothing to do with immigration visas. It's a different notion of the green card, where if a sorry, I'll go back. If a Jewish person were looking to buy a home, for example, they would drive with the buyer's agent, and if the buyer's agent had not yet had a chance to communicate with the seller's agent, he would put a little green card in the window of his automobile, and when they would drive up to the house, then the seller's agent would see that green card and know that was a signal that the potential buyer was Jewish, and then the seller's agent would come out and say, sorry, it's already been sold, it's off the market. And so it was another sort of trick to prevent Jewish people from being able to buy homes in the area. And what broke that system was the development of UC San Diego. When UC San Diego was built, the new chancellor, Roger Revelle, went down to the business elites in La Jolla, and specifically the realtors, and said they had to make up their minds whether they wanted to have a university or an anti-Semitic covenant. And that was the key dividing line in taking away that policy. But even to this day, if you look at these old redlining maps in San Diego and also in many other cities nationally, and look at where minority populations are today, they're not exactly the same, but they're clearly having multi-decades long effects. Okay, so let's talk a bit about other kinds of state citizenship laws in California and come up closer to the present. So in this chart here, this is done by a couple of colleagues that participated in this project. Anything below 0 is a restrictive policy at the state level in California, restrictive in the sense that it was restricting what immigrants could do or whether or not they were even allowed to come into the state. And then if it's above that 0, it's a policy that is in some way more accommodating of immigrants. And you can see that there was a long period of restriction, but a major shift just in the last 20 years of more and more accommodating policies. So some of the most important ones began in 1979, where the LA Police Department issued Special Order 40, which prevented local LAPD from reporting unauthorized immigrants to federal immigration authorities, then the Immigration and Naturalization Service, what would now be Department of Homeland Security, unless they had committed a serious crime. So in other words, that in a city with a lot of immigrants, a lot of unauthorized immigrants as well, the idea is that the police shouldn't routinely go about trying to enforce federal immigration laws. And they should leave that to the federal government. I mentioned briefly Prop 187 when I arrived in California. I imagine some of you were also here at the time. This was a referendum that tried to limit access to all kinds of public services, including K through 12 elementary education, something which the Supreme Court in 1982 had ruled in Plyler v. Doe was available to all residents, regardless of their unauthorized status. But Prop 187 sought to limit that, as well as other kinds of government benefits. It required state officials at all levels, including schools, to report people who they suspected of being in the country unlawfully. That bill passed. Sorry, not that bill passed. That referendum passed. That passed with a pretty healthy margin of the state's population. But almost all of its provisions were struck down in federal court because of the principle that was established in the late 19th century that the federal government has a preeminent jurisdiction over immigration policymaking. So it's an area that continues to be litigated around the edges, but a state like California can no longer say, well, immigrants can't come here, or immigrants from a particular place can't come here, or do make these other kinds of rules that are really the purview of Congress, according to the ways that the court has ruled on these issues. Okay, so since 2000, though, there have been a number of accommodations, making life easier rather than more difficult for unauthorized immigrants, beginning with in-state tuition in 2001, banning restrictive local landlord ordinances. This was a case that came out of Escondido in San Diego County, where the city council was trying to have landlords look at the immigration papers and not rent to people who couldn't show that they were in the U.S. legally. And so the state legislature said that's not the business of local landlords to do that. You know, immigration control is a federal issue. Granting access to financial aid in colleges and universities in 2011. Eligibility for driver's licenses. There's a long saga there, but that finally passed in 2013. Eligibility for various kinds of professional licenses the following year. And then there have been several laws around the relationship between local law enforcement and federal immigration law enforcement. the same issue that I just raised in the discussion of LA's Special Order 40 in the 1970s. So that issue has continued to result in all kinds of state and local level ordinances. This 2013, the so-called Trust Act, stipulated that officers can only enforce immigration detainers issued by ICE. This is when ICE sends a notice to a jail, for example, in California, saying that they want to take custody of a particular person, and that the state would only cooperate with ICE if that person had been convicted of one of the specified serious crimes. There was another law that created less political heat, but arguably something that's really important for a lot of people's economic well-being, is pursuing cases against employers that didn't pay their employees' wages. The issue of wage theft is extremely important. It's extremely common according to surveys of immigrant workers, especially in sectors that have more menial characteristics. The wage theft is extremely widespread. So that the state has created this measure in 2015. More regulations around this interaction between state and federal law enforcement, so that, for example, there would be safe zones that would prohibit immigration enforcement by the federal government in California public schools, hospitals, and in courthouses. And this kind of issue we've also seen in other states, but California has become a real say a national leader in trying to create these more accommodating policies. And then the most recent versions have to do with specific sub communities, undocumented children having access, if they're low income, to Medi-Cal, the Medi-Cal program, and that was also expanded to lower income adults, and at the opposite end of the age scale of those 50 years or older, just in a couple of years ago. So I'll finish my remarks here talking about public opinion and how has public opinion around immigration issues and policy changed in California over the last several decades, and also how does California compare to the rest of the US on these issues? And this is drawing from the work of Heinel and colleagues who wrote a chapter in the book that I showed you at the beginning. So the polling organizations, there are a number of different polling organizations, all the details are in that chapter. But they've been asking Californians for a long time now, what should immigration levels be? Should they be increased? And that's the orange line. Should they be the same as they are now in the dotted gray line, or should they be decreased in the green line? And the vast majority of the population, around 60%, thought that the population should, that immigration should be decreased back in the early and mid 90s when I arrived in the state. And that's changed a lot, right? That's now down to about 30%. So that's fallen by half to 2016. The other change is that it's a minority view, but it's a growing minority view. It's almost a quarter of the population now that says that immigration levels should be increased. So those are pretty significant changes over that time frame. And then people were asked, and these are representative samples of all adults in the state of California, are immigrants a benefit to California because of their hard work and job skills, or more, are they a burden because they use public services? So in black, the top line there, that's the percentage that think that overall immigrants are more likely to be a benefit. You can see a really strong majority, just 3/4 of the population now thinks that they're more of a benefit than a burden. And that's, increased from less than half at the beginning of this time series. Now, there are big differences, no surprise, by all kinds of sociodemographic characteristics and political preferences around whether or not people think that immigration to the state should be decreased. So here, asking that question, we see Democrats from left to right here. That's a very much minority position among Democrats. Maybe 18% or so think that it should be decreased. whereas more than 60% of Republicans think that it should be decreased. And that's a similar divide that you see between liberals and conservatives. Those are categories that sharply overlap with each other. Looking at ethno-racial groups, 40% of whites think that it should be decreased, much higher than the percentage of Asians who would think that, which is less than 10%. But it's worth signaling that even among whites, that's a minority view now, as of 2016 at least. Also, we see a difference here between the US born, who are about twice as likely as foreign born to think that immigration levels should be decreased. But of the US born, it's a minority now. Who expressed that view in a poll. By education, there's not a huge gap, but people with lower levels of education in general are more restrictive in their preferences. By income, there's not a huge gap, but people with less money slightly more restrictive in their attitudes. A big generational gap between younger and older Californians. Older Californians are much more likely to have a restrictive preference than the younger generation. Women are less restrictive than men, although it's not a huge effect relative to some of these other effects. So what do the Heinel and all conclude, broadly speaking, is that Californians in general, the majority of them, hold more positive views of immigrants. They favor policies that are more inclusive, that are more permissive. But there's still a sizable share of the population that's very worried about immigration and its effects. It would like to clamp down on immigration and the services and opportunities for immigrants in the state. So why has there been that shift, though? That shift to more accommodation, despite the views of this large minority? And it's the number one reason that they find is that immigrants are a larger share of the population than they used to be. That is a much bigger effect than changes in attitudes among the native-born population. Of whites, their views have not shifted that much, and that there is a large minority that's quite antagonistic to the immigrants and further immigration. So that is the story that they tell about that shift. And then relative to the rest of the US, the big picture is that Californians are much more favorable towards immigrants. They think that immigrants are much more likely to have a positive contribution overall. But whites in California are not very different from whites around the US on this issue. So I will leave it at that and be very happy to take any questions and hear your own thoughts on these issues.
Thank you. Have people submitted their questions? Anne?
I have one from Sue, and she wanted to know if there were restrictions against the Irish back in the 1800s, that when they wanted to come and work on railroads or whatever, and that since if that was something that was discriminated against or not, they didn't bother with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so my own, I'm FitzGerald. So my own great-great-grandfather came from Ireland in 1835, and we have his record. There was no immigration record. There was just the shipping record. He came as an illiterate young laborer. I think he was 18 or 19, and walked off the ship. There were no federal laws to restrict people coming at all in those days. So it was a period of open immigration policies. Now, Irish did experience a lot of social discrimination, especially those who were Catholic. And a lot of the early anti-immigrant sentiment at a national level, this is not so much a California story as a national story, was directed against Catholic immigrants. And the stated fear is that they would be an agent of the Pope and undermine democracy if they were allowed to come.
I remember that argument when Kennedy ran for president. Okay, let's see if there's any more now. Are there are the net of immigrants, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to read it, and I think there might have been a little bit of a typo here. Is there a net of benefits if the children and grandchildren in annual amounts that when you showed that slide, was that talking about the benefit, was that annually?
No, that benefit was over their lifetime.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Let's see. Okay, maybe we just should let people try and talk because I'm not seeing any more.
I see
see.
that, Rita, you have your hand up.
Okay, Rita.
Oh,
Hi.
was that me? I'm sorry.
You have your hand up, so I was calling
do.
on you,
Yes.
Rita.
Yeah, my question had to do with the number of immigrants legally permitted into the country by country. And is that still, it's an argument that is used against undocumented immigrants trying to come into the country, people saying, well, they should have gone through the legal, procedure. However, as I remember, and I don't know if it's still true, the numbers permitted in from Mexico were unusually low compared with the numbers permitted in from countries where there's very little interest in emigrating to the United States. Is that still true?
Yeah, so that's almost the case. And I'll quickly explain. So from 1921 to 1965, the US had a quota system that explicitly assigned an annual cap on how many could come from each nationality, and that discriminated against some nationalities and preferred other nationalities. In 1965, that went away. But what it was replaced with was a system that creates the same annual cap in a particular set of categories of family reunification and employment visas. And so that means that if you are coming from a country with a lot of demand to immigrate and a long history of immigration, you have the same number of slots as a country with very little history of immigration to the US and very little demand to come. And so it's about 26,000 per year is the cap in these family reunification visas and a certain categories of them. What that means is that if you are from Mexico or the Philippines and you are trying to come in as the sibling of a US citizen who's sponsoring you, you have to wait more than 20 years in line. After you've met all the qualifications, your line is more than 20 years long. For the rest of the world, it's still very long, but it's about 10 or 11 years. So that is a way that even though there's not a specific number of visas assigned to each country, if you're from Mexico or the Philippines, you face a severe disadvantage. And this is one of the issues that's periodically discussed in Congress, is that they should just get rid of the country caps and give everybody an equal shot regardless of their nationality. This also, less dramatically, but this also disadvantages Indians in a particular employment visa category.
Okay, Heather, would you like to ask a question now?
Yes, I'm curious about if there's been research into what is driving the Caucasian population's continuing dislike of immigration. Like what's really driving that, and has anybody figured out how to address that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so over time, it's the whites in the US have much more positive views of immigrants than they did, say, in the 19th century, when you saw it was almost homogeneously racist and trying to keep people from coming in at all. So there has, over that time frame, there's been a big shift among the white population. But as we saw, when it comes to these other attitudes about immigration in California, do you think that there should be more or fewer? Are they on benefit? Are they on balance a benefit or a detriment? And that's where you still see a lot of hostility. So why is that? You know, a lot of that is fear of cultural change, especially fears around language. There is the fact that if you recall one of the graphs that I showed you early on, it was of the percentage foreign born in California and the US over time. And you saw that it used the levels actually used to be much higher in the 19th century, and then they dipped, and then they're coming back up to closer to their historical average. So, you know, that's something that an historian is aware of, but in the experience of an individual, people grew up at a time when there was very little immigration. So the low point of immigration to the US was around 1960, and 5% of the population was foreign born. And so, I mean, that's what people are remembering, is that in their lifetimes, it's gone from being a country with not so many immigrants to a lot of immigrants. And, you know, most people are not historians, so they're not thinking about the fact that, you know, their own grandparents or great grandparents might have been immigrants. So that's another dynamic. And then, I mean, there's just, you know, also some sub part of the population that is simply racist, that simply does not want people who are not, you know, light skinned to be in the society. And in surveys, that's a small minority of people who will admit to that. But it's there. You can find that. It's maybe, I don't know, 10. I would have to look at this particular survey, but if memory serves, something on the order of 10-15% of the US population, and that would be overwhelmingly white, say simply that they don't want non-whites in the US. So those are some of the reasons.
Okay,
Thank you.
Linnea, do you want to ask
Yeah.
your question now?
Yes. So what do you expect the impact will be of the expiration of Title 42? And how do you evaluate Biden's proposed regulations?
Mm-hmm. Right. So Title 42, we'll recall, this is a title in the US public health law passed in the 1940s that gives the Center for Disease Control the authority to temporarily limit entrances into the US. But it was activated during the Trump administration, and we don't have time to talk about all the details probably, but it was basically used to turn back asylum seekers from most countries at the border, under the pretext that if they came in, that they would be a source of communicable disease, specifically COVID. Why do I say a pretext? Because it has since emerged that Stephen Miller, the architect of Trump's immigration policies, was trying to use Title 42 before the COVID-19 pandemic, and that the CDC resisted its use, but ultimately that was a political decision made by the White House and forced on them. So that's why I say that it was a pretext, and also because, you know, diseases don't have passports, and you know, plenty of people were coming to the US carrying COVID, but that was at a time when the US had some of the highest COVID rates in the world. And if you were to have a serious COVID-based restriction policy, it wouldn't select out people based on their visa status or lack thereof. But that's why it was a pretext. So I'm not in favor of using public health restrictions as a pretext for immigration control. I think it's, yeah, I think that's intellectually dishonest, and it's just bad policy making.
And Heather, you have another question?
Yes, I think in California and across much of the US, I think the native population isn't reproducing at a rate that's sufficient to replace themselves. And we're also getting older demographically. And I guess one of my concerns is if we don't have more immigration, you know, what is going to happen both to our economy and to the care of those of us as we get older who need, you know, more assistance. It seems to me that we have some economic negative impacts if we have insufficient immigration, and we currently seem to be on track to do that.
Yeah, I think I couldn't say it any better than that. One of the great advantages, though, that the US has vis-a-vis many other rich countries and Europe and Japan is that our fertility rates are higher than in those places. They're not quite at replacement. If you're thinking about the native-born population, the replacement level is 2.1 children per woman over her reproductive lifetime. And so it's lower than that now in the US, but because we have immigration, then we have a population that is slowly expanding and it's generating economic growth. And all of these workers, as you suggested, they're overwhelmingly in the working age population, and then they're supporting senior citizens. So this is a much bigger problem in countries like Japan, for example, where the population is predicted to dramatically shrink, and they have only about 1 or 2% of the population that's foreign born. And that's considered to be a very likely disaster in Japan. And it's a big problem in Europe. There's not a single country in Europe where fertility is at replacement levels. And this is going to be a bigger problem around the world. It's almost an iron law that as countries become wealthy, their fertility rates fall. And everywhere in the world, fertility rates are collapsing. So in Mexico, for example, the fertility rate was around 8 per woman in 1960. And now it's basically at replacement levels. It's fallen. So it's one of the reasons why in the long run, we'll see much less Mexican immigration to the US, because Mexico is likely to actually need workers coming from other countries. But in Central America, the fertility rates have also collapsed. So this is an issue that I think not enough people are aware of. So I'm glad you brought it up.
Thank you.
Okay, and I can't see whose hand is up. Let me see. Kathy? Do you want to go ahead? Oh, you're muted. Kathy, you're muted. Let me see. Can you unmute and then we'll be able to hear you?
Fine. I kept turning myself off. So, Professor FitzGerald, isn't there sort of a paradox between countries like ours needing a continual flow of people to keep up with services and assisting people as we are an aging population, and then the climate or the concern that there are too many people for the earth to handle? Like, what was it that there were 8 billion? What was the population? 8 billion, something like that, that countries can't have, like the United States shouldn't have that many more people because of the environment. So isn't that sort of a paradox?
So it's certainly true that the population is increasing in ways that are putting massive stress on the planet. I totally agree with you on that. All demographers predict that we're nearing the peak of the world's population. In fact, it's probably going to peak faster than the earlier models suggested, just because places like China have, their population has actually started to shrink. Probably this spring, China will no longer be the world's most populous country as India becomes the most populous country. So the population of the world is increasing. That's putting stress, but it's about to peak. And the projections are that it will peak around 10 billion and then decline again, because as the people become more wealthy with economic growth, they want fewer children. So I think we're probably, entering this kind of peak problem that you've identified. But I do think that in the long run, and what do I mean by the long run? I think over the next, 50 years, that situation is likely to get better. And the bigger problem will be this mismatch between not having enough younger workers and having more people who have retired. And the pension systems have never put enough money away for retirees. They're always supported by people who are putting money into the system currently around the world. So yeah, there's a big you call it a paradox or a trade-off. And the kinds of problems that we're facing now are going to evolve into a different kind of problem because of that mismatch.
Linnea?
Can you talk at all about the percentage of K through 12 public school students who have either one or two foreign-born parents, and the degree to which the school systems are successful in teaching language skills?
Yeah, so in California, half of the students have at least one parent who is foreign born, or they themselves are foreign born. Again, and of that, I can't remember the exact percentage, but it's mostly people who have a parent, because I showed you earlier in the demographic pyramid that the percentage of the state that's actually a child foreign born is fairly small, but about half are first and second generation. How well is the state doing at teaching English? I think it's doing a very good job overall. It's the US, and let me shift now to talking about the US because I'm less familiar with the California details on this. The US is basically following a similar knowledge of linguistic assimilation now as it did 100 years ago, where the first generation strongly prefers to speak whatever language they spoke when they arrive, and their kids strongly prefer to speak English, but have some facility with their parents' mother tongue. And by the third generation, the parents' mother tongue, or now the grandparents' mother tongue, is almost gone. I mean, people might know a few words of greetings or terms for foods and things like that, but they couldn't carry on a conversation. That is the dominant model in the US. There are some exceptions. It's slightly less true among the Mexican origin population along the border. So in a place like South Texas, that model of three generations it takes longer, and people are much more likely to be bilingual with some degree of fluency for longer. But regardless, whether you're in South Texas or in Minnesota or anywhere else, the second generation very strongly English dominant. And for Asian origin populations, that's an even faster transition, where the second generation, again, I'm talking about on a population level, there's lots of exceptions, we're talking about millions of people, but on a population level, the second generation has very little facility in their parents' Asian mother tongue.
I actually wanted to ask a question myself, and I'm not sure that I don't know if this was really some part of your discussion, but when they had the racial covenants saying that you couldn't sell to blacks or whatever group, and suppose that an individual homeowner wanted to sell to somebody, would the equal agreement between the buyer and seller prevail, or would they actually be stopped from transferring the house?
So that's a great question, and I don't know who would enforce those restrictions. I know that they were enforced in practice, but I don't know if someone had tried to break the restriction and they weren't, say, seeking a mortgage. I mean, if they were seeking a mortgage, we can see that wouldn't have worked out, at least for a period in the 30s, because there was a specific rule, at least for a while, against giving a federally backed mortgage to someone who didn't have one of those covenants. Yeah, but I don't know. Mike Davis, who just recently passed away, the author of City of Courts, which was largely about LA, did quite a bit of research around racial covenants in Southern California. So his work would be where I would start to try to find an answer to that question. But I will look that up. That's a great.
I was kind of curious because when I was in first grade and kindergarten, first grade, we lived in Santa Ana, And at that time, it was a very new housing development. Now, of course, it's, you know, whatever. But I remember that when we were about to move, you know, people started coming through the house and looking at the house, and my mother, you know, give them tours. And there was a couple, a Black couple, and this was something that stood out in my mind. She took them through the house and everything like that. And she said, if you want to buy the house, I will sell it to you. She said, but you should know that the neighbors are probably not going to be very friendly. And then that was kind of the last of it. But I had to ask her what all of that was about at the time. So that was one of the first times I'd heard about how, you know, things were restricted. I haven't been doing the chat very well because people have been raising their hands. So if anybody else would like to raise their hands, I'm happy to let you go. This is Kathy again. Still muted?
There, okay, sorry. So my question is, well, actually, it's more of a, do you know, are you familiar with, I believe it's Rich Rothstein's book, The Color of Law? Oh, okay. I know his wife really well, and so she recommended it. It's a very interesting and well documented with footnotes book about immigration in the housing, primarily the housing sector. And the first 3 chapters especially go through segregation in public housing in New York City and California. If you're not familiar with it, I highly recommend it. Richard Rothstein, his wife Vivian is a friend of mine, and it's called The Color of Law. Lots of really good information. And I read, and Anne, you were saying, well, anyway, I recommend it. In addition to, yes, Mike Davis, unfortunately we lost him, but this is a very good, well done book with like lots of data that you can use. So anyway, I just wanted to say that, to recommend that.
Yeah, thanks for the tip. I will definitely look that up, and hopefully that will have the answer to our question about enforcement.
Yeah, actually, he does write about that, and I can't off the top of my head remember, but I want to say that attempts at enforcement were made, depending on the area.
Well, after leaving California, we moved back east, and they had some much more, I guess, interesting ways of trying to keep you from out of certain neighborhoods or who they would exclude. And one of them was that, I still remember this too, that if you looked in this one area in New Jersey around one of the lakes, they had, if you wanted to buy the house, you had to join in the country club, and the country club could restrict whatever it was, even if, you know, there was no deed restriction. Which I never heard of that in California, but there was, you know, there were different ways of doing things.
Well, are we coming to a close of the questions? And before we do that, I'd like to, if Nosh is still here, I'd like to introduce Dr. Nosh McTaggart, who is the executive director of our league. And I'm wondering if, and has been responsible for all the technology today. And I wonder if you have any comments or questions. Are you there, Nosh?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah.
I first of all just want to thank you for this wonderful talk. As a child of Jamaican immigrants and being first generation born here, was born in Miami, Florida, and my parents moved to Los Angeles when I was 9 months old. It's very interesting to to listen to this talk and kind of just give a historical perspective of immigration in this country. So I really appreciated that. I love to learn about, you know, immigration patterns, and yeah, I just
No,
want
I'm
to thank
listening
you again.
to
This has
Zoom
been
on my
super
iPad.
informative. So thank you, Dr. Fitzgerald.
For a minute, yeah,
What's happening?
he's close, not quite.
Okay. Are there any further
I
questions?
know, where are you? Oh,
I don't see anything else in the chat, and I'm glad that people were able to communicate by raising their hand. It helps. It's very helpful. And so I just also agree with our the other people that this has been a really good basic instruction on how things have changed.
As we close, I want to thank you so much for speaking to us today. It's been really very informative, and there are lots of comments about how much we've appreciated your presentation today. So thank you so much for coming and talking to us. It's been really great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joyce, and
I guess
appreciate everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Yeah, thank you. We're all in our little squares, so I'm sure there'll be a round of applause, but that doesn't work with virtual sessions. So thanks again for coming. Appreciate it.
Cheers.
And thank you for those in our audience for participating today.